Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How are you doing? It is Tuesday, November 10th, 2020. Time for another show. As I mentioned in this morning's post, letting you know that we were live on the air. It has been a full year now since the 2020 elections, or at least what feels like it. This year has been a long one. Many twists and turns, to say the very least. I think eyes have to be diverted today over, at least for some of the time, over to the Supreme Court. The answer won't be made readily available today. They'll just be hearing the latest challenge to the Affordable Care Act. And, everything about the country hangs into balance. And first test of Amy Coney Barrett, I guess. We just won't know whether she, how she performs on the test. I don't know if there's a way for her to pass the test, per se. How she performs on the test for, a good long time. We have to wait for them to come down with their decision and then try and figure out what it means. But everybody's favorite parlor game will be spending part of today insisting that they know. And there are people who are paid, whose job it is to know how these things will come out and to predict it and to know how the justices will rule on these things. And it's exciting times for them, I suppose, because you've thrown the new curveball of a brand new justice who's something of an enigma into the middle of all this. Everyone knows she's pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, and what that's likely to mean. What we don't know is whether she will have any interesting or novel approaches to getting to the result that conservatives want, and whether she will have any influence to exert over her fellow justices, who used to be her bosses, when it comes time to hash these things out and decide who's going to be writing for the majority and who will be concurring and dissenting along or at the margins of all of this. Ordinarily, I guess you sort of figure that a brand new justice, like brand new anything anywhere, sort of try and keep a low profile and find their place over the course of the next couple of years. But these days, a lot of the justices and judges on higher appeals courts, of course, come to us through the pipeline of elite law schools, their top the positions for top students in law review, and then, of course, clerking for the Supreme Court, which, is supposed to give them some sort of insider's understanding of how the minds on the courts work. And I think that it largely does. Some of it is, window dressing, but some of it is real. So we'll see how assertive she is in putting herself into the mix, or whether she just goes along for the ride. And which ride is it? Is it the Alito-Thomas ride? Is it the Roberts preserve the dignity of the court through being politically, walking on eggshells, or walking through this minefield, perhaps, looking to preserve the prestige, dignity, independence of the Supreme Court itself? Does that still apply? Was that just a game that he was playing until he could get a 6-3 court? We'll have to find out. Lots tied up in that. It is Tuesday. I'm sure Joan will want to talk about that a little bit, unless, of course, she's writing about it now for the front page at Daily Kos, and it carries over to 11 o'clock to get that done. But I think certainly on her mind. Also, of course, I guess to save her the trouble, I will remind you all that part of what she'll focus on ordinarily is reminding us that the government is only funded through early to mid-December of December of 2020. This year, of course, just about a month from now. And I can't bring the date to mind off the top of my head, but for some reason I want to say December 12th. Is that right? I see it's a Saturday. So that's kind of where they might park it there, or on a Friday ordinarily, when you're doing a CR and you're going to pick a deadline for the thing to run out. End of the work week we'll usually do it. And I don't know, I guess I guess it's not that infrequent that they'll put it on a Saturday just to give themselves the full 5 days to work on it, and then vote Friday night and then take off to go home for the weekend. So I guess if it had been like a Wednesday or something, I'd be suspicious of it. But I've seen it put on a Wednesday too. Sometimes they think putting it in the middle of the week works best. Who knows? There's no real pattern to it. Anyway, that too hanging out there. Also, the gray and growing gray area of constitutional law, such as it is, which I compare, and I've had the opportunity to do that this morning on, what's that communications website we all use so often? Twitter, yes, that's the one, which says that I compare constitutional law sometimes at this level to quantum physics. You know, you learn all your high school physics, maybe you took AP physics. Everything you learn there is true for the most part, and for 99% of daily life, it explains everything that can happen and why it would happen. But then at a certain level, there are just things that happen at extreme temperatures, extreme pressures, extreme levels of gravitational attraction, gravitational fields, what have you, that just don't fit. And quantum physics is the only thing that explains it. And ultimately, at some level, every piece of the universe can be pared down to a small enough particle at which point quantum physics takes over, which is why it still works for 99% of everything that it needs to work for. Well, anyway, you get the idea. The fact is that Schoolhouse Rock has a quantum level too. They just don't have any time to teach it to on a Saturday. So we do it here 2 hours a day on the radio. And we'll be operating at a level in a couple of days when they consider these cases and then appeal these cases and then appeal the appeals of the cases and ask for rehearings of the appealed cases, etc. And when the Congress is perhaps asked to make decisions for itself about matters of statutory and constitutional law, you'll find that the dictionary definitions and things you learned in Schoolhouse Rock or think that everybody knows as an American or is on the citizenship test or whatever just don't hold up under the extreme pressures and extreme gravitational fields that you're working with when you get to a point where the Congress decides for itself the procedure by which the key offices of the executive branch will be filled, and the Supreme Court decides whether it will or won't intervene in various ways, and then of course the Supreme Court itself made up in the extreme gravitational fields of the Congress and presidential political worlds as well. It's just where all physics ceases to apply. Now Joan tells me via that website that we all use to communicate these days, Twitter, it is in fact December 11th that we're funded to. So December 12th would be the day we run out of funding. I should have guessed that they would want the thing done so that they could go home on Friday the 11th. So that, let's see, I'll ask Joan when she gets here whether we're funded through the 11th and therefore the 12th is the day the funding runs out, or are we funded through the 10th and it runs out on the 11th? But they very frequently will schedule these things. This gives you an idea of who's doing the work and what their approach to this is. This is just the government shutting down in the middle of a transition that might not be happening in between two presidential administrations and a major constitutional crisis plus a pandemic. And maybe who knows what else gets thrown in there. How do you schedule it? Well, when would you like to go home? That's it. What time is my flight? Okay. Well, that's when it runs out. So, okay. So, like I said, quantum physics. Everything breaks down at a certain level. I need to finish up this brief tweet apologizing to Joy Reid here for just a second. A very weird Twitter type situation that was hanging out there today. I happened to notice all the people reacting confusedly, I guess, to Joyanne Reid's mistaken tweet. I don't know where this came from exactly, but I don't know. Anyway, from out of the blue, essentially, she was talking about 538.com and the reason that 538 is called 538, which was recently a topic of discussion in my own house, as a matter of fact. And so I brought this up just before showtime to point out that not everybody, knows offhand immediately. There's a certain subsection of the political junkie world where just saying 538 makes, it's shorthand. It makes sense. And there's now a larger subsection of the political junkie world thinks first, oh, you were talking about 538.com, Nate Silver's site. Yes, true. Why is it called 538.com? And I guess she had some theory. I don't know. She was working on the election problem and the problem of resolving the presidential election. And I don't know, is it still out there? Or did she delete it or something? I could look around. But basically, she said 538 was called 538.com because her theory went, I guess the difference, the margin in Florida in 2000 in the election between George W. Bush and Al Gore was it was around that. It was 537 perhaps votes, she was saying, and so therefore 538 had this particular connotation, except, I think a lot of you probably have, figured out by now. 538.com refers to the 538 electoral votes that are out there in the universe. With the coronavirus that Ben Carson caught, by the way. I don't know, did we make mention yesterday, or did we find out after the show that Ben Carson had caught the coronavirus? And basically they asked him about where does he think he got it, and everybody knows where he got it. He got it at the White House on election night, but he said, I don't know, out there in the universe somewhere, probably, which is true. I mean, I'm certain that it did happen in the universe. There's their quantum physics problem again. It couldn't have happened anywhere else, so he's not wrong. We'll put it that way. Anyway, Joanne making this mistake, and it's a double mistake because I don't think that was actually the margin between the two candidates after the first count in Florida anyway, though it's in that ballpark. But no, 538, the number of electoral votes. And I just, I got nothing against Joy Reid at all. I think she's doing a fantastic job with her show. I just had to take it out. It was just hanging out there, this low-hanging fruit. I insisted that the 538 and 538.com stands for assault rifle, and everybody knows that. And there's an even smaller subsection of political junkies who get that joke. But they're all on my Twitter feed, so I just went for it. And then I just thought, I should say, I'm sorry, Joy, I wasn't making fun of you. It's just, it was there. Anyway, does anybody get the joke? How about my radio feed? Do you understand? I think so, right? There was always a big fight in the gun world about AR-15s, which people love to say, for various reasons, stands for Assault Rifle 15. And so therefore, people, I guess it starts with gun nuts saying, AR-15s aren't assault weapons. There's no such thing as assault weapons. It's a made-up term that gun haters are using to take away our guns, except... yes, there are such things as assault weapons. Partly it's how we define them, but the marketing materials for the AR-15 are all about it being an assault weapon. They loved calling it an assault weapon for a certain number of years, I guess until there was an assault weapons ban. And then after the assault weapons ban expired, they loved calling it an assault weapon again. But no, I guess truth be told, the AR and AR-15 is just a AR for Armalite, the company that first developed the AR-15 style assault rifle. Not that it matters a great deal, but now it's blossomed into a second generation of usage in which people who know full well, or who just know it drives people crazy, know full well that AR doesn't stand for assault rifle, but know that it drives gun nuts up the wall to say so. And you can waste half their day if you make mention of that false factoid, and they'll spend the rest of their day trying to prove to you that it doesn't stand for assault rifle. People love to walk around saying it stands for assault rifle. We're we're not deep people, I guess, here in this subsection. Not smart. Anyway, we should be spending our time on other things, including, again, the Supreme Court. I do have some work set aside to try and catch us up on what's going on there. Although it took me away this morning thinking about the Supreme Court and how this case sets up something else that I could tell you that occupied my mind as I was thinking it over, and is occupying my mind now as I search for where the hell is the stuff I put aside on the case today. So I'll just keep looking and talking at the same time. It occurred to me that, here we go, that one of the less discussed big downsides of having a 6-3 conservative court, besides the one we all talk about, which is there's a 6-3 conservative court, this is terrible, is that having twice as many conservative justices as liberal justices sets up a situation in which conservative Federalist Society types now have twice the capacity for grooming their top law students, elite school law students, and some non-elite ones that they want to make into elite practitioners, but grooming them as from the position of Supreme Court clerk. Supreme Court clerks are hot commodities. They tend to be able to land top jobs at the most expensive and exclusive private firms where they can earn a tremendous amount of money, or elite positions in the practice of law for the government, working for various cabinet departments, the Department of Justice, etc. They very frequently find their way to the federal bench within a couple of years, or to law school professorships while they wait to be appointed to the bench, or move into elite practice, private practice, etc. It's a very clear pipeline and a lifestyle and opportunity that is available to very few, but will now be available to twice as many conservatives as liberals, essentially. Now, sometimes people bend things a little bit. It's not entirely the case that every conservative justice will have a group of exclusively conservative clerks. There are still a few out there who like to shake things up and say, well, I'll hire 2 or 3. Some justices, I think they go about, it varies from time to time under different circumstances, but between 3 and 4 clerks for a year, for a term, beginning in October, etc. But anyway, so they'll sometimes say, why don't I'll take another person who has a more liberal point of view intentionally, and mix them in with these other conservatives so that they can be crushed and dissuaded of their views on the law and change their minds and become a conservative. Or, the real excuse, of course, here is, well, I want to be able to have someone who can at least anticipate the liberal position on this so that we can crush it in our writing, in our dissents or concurrences, whatever our opinions are here. We want somebody to be able to bounce ideas off of and beat the crap out of them and bury them every time. Or, sometimes I want to hear that other point of view. Maybe I'll change my mind on something. Others are more straightforward and they're just ideological, etc. But at any rate, each term, each justice gets to pick, in the neighborhood of 3 clerks on whom they will bestow this great honor. And now there will be 6 justices able to choose 3 to 4 clerks apiece on the conservative side, only 3 on the liberal side. And because they so frequently end up in either law professorships or on the federal bench somewhere vying for advancement through the ranks, what it means is the Federalist Society has the built-in opportunity to create more of these automatons that they can use to populate the federal bench whenever there's a vacancy. And yeah, that's something that the Senate continues to spend its time on right now, still installing federal judges right up to the end, despite all the so-called rules, etc. I told you we get to this level where quantum physics bends everything and rules aren't rules anymore. So they continue to stuff people onto the benches right up to the last moment. I'm sure Joan may have a thing or two to say about that. We could occupy more of the Senate's time, perhaps, using the ability to control the agenda in the House of Representatives, send them a few impeachments. There are a few more that are still ripe and ripening every day, overripe, that we could be sending over there. Not that they necessarily, again, at this quantum level, need to acknowledge the rules of which proceedings should take precedence. They could just bypass the whole thing or dismiss any case that they get offhand. But I don't know. To me, possibly worth contemplating anyway, or giving a shot to. Let's see. Maybe I jump over to the piece I had put aside. I actually have a HuffPost piece on what's going on in the Supreme Court today. Why don't we waste the last couple minutes before the first break on that? Trump's last desperate attack on Obamacare goes to the Supreme Court this week by Jonathan Cohn over at HuffPost. The election is over, but the threat to health insurance for 21 million Americans isn't. And really, if there's any way they could figure out how to threaten the health insurance of many more Americans, I'm sure they would be pleased to know. Donald Trump, he writes, has lost the presidential election. That's a good way of starting off. But his last desperate effort to kill the Affordable Care Act will get its day before the U.S. Supreme Court on Tuesday, that's today, when the justices hear arguments in a Republican-backed lawsuit alleging that Obamacare is unconstitutional. The case, known as California versus Texas, I root for California in this one, is the third such challenge to reach the high court since the law's 2010 enactment. And the stakes are as high as ever if the justices wipe out the Affordable Care Act, as they could, as 18 Republican state officials and the Trump administration have asked it to do. Roughly 21 million Americans could lose their health insurance, according to independent projections. The law's protections for people with pre-existing conditions, you remember that term, would no longer be in effect. Less visible reforms, covering everything from billing fraud to food calorie postings, would vanish, and the entire healthcare system could plunge into chaos in a pandemic during a transition. The merits of the case are notoriously weak. Even conservative and libertarian lawyers who supported past challenges to Obamacare have filed friend of the court briefs urging the justices to reject this one. For that reason, many legal observers think the chances of this lawsuit succeeding are relatively small. However, I guess at this point I will point out the case is here. And if your case is notoriously weak, you can opt not to waste the court's time at all by saying, we're just not going to take this case. It's too stupid. But they opted to take it. So 4 justices at a minimum have something they want to say on this one. And we've added a new justice since. And goodness, if she decides there's something she wants to say about this case, if the first 4 were all on the same side, and it's not certain in my mind that there was, we know who they were, of course. I just don't know. So I could tell you very easily, I suppose, if we'd looked at who voted to take the case. But anyway, point is the makeup of the court is different this time than it has been in the past, and the atmosphere in which they're operating is very different as well. Where we left off here, the lawsuit has already gotten favorable rulings from 3 lower court judges. You know, morons perhaps, but judges nonetheless. All 3 were Republican appointees, just like the Supreme Court majority, which now numbers 6 conservatives with Amy Coney Barrett recently placed on the bench. Tuesday's oral arguments will offer the first hints of how she and the rest of the justices view this case, although an actual ruling will likely wait several months, maybe even until the spring. Next section. Almost no legal expert thinks the case has merit. That's so weird. And yet here it is. In theory, even the conservative justices should make quick work of the case. The basis for the lawsuit is the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate. As originally written, the health care law imposed a financial penalty on people who could get insurance, but did not. I guess before I go any further, I'll just say, almost no legal expert thinks the case has merit. And yet here it is, and also P.S. over in this other portion of our minds for what to think about today are several lawsuits in several states filed by the Trump campaign and its allies, which almost no legal experts think have any merit. What do you know? Anyway, The real idea behind the suit we're actually talking about here was the affordable, or rather, the individual mandate. You know about the idea behind that, was to make sure that healthy people enrolled before they got sick, so that they would have protection against bills, so they wouldn't require charity care that would raise costs throughout the system, and so that insurers could keep premiums low and stable. I think we all understand that, but it was there and in the way, and I had to read it. The mandate was always among the law's most controversial features and was the basis of the first legal challenge, which suggested Congress lacked authority to impose such a requirement. The court rejected that lawsuit, with Chief Justice John Roberts leading a 5-4 majority on the theory that the financial penalty was simply a tax and Congress has the power to impose taxes. And of course, in 2017, Congress reduced the penalty to zero as part of the Republican tax cut bill that Trump signed. 20 Republican state officials then filed a new lawsuit, which was the plan, arguing that if the penalty was zero, then the mandate, whose language remains a part of the statute, can no longer be a tax. Although that's not necessarily the case. It's just the tax and the rate's zero. I don't know. I just invented it. There. Saved everything. That means the mandate is an unconstitutional command, according to this lawsuit, and because the law's component parts are so interconnected, well, the lawsuit says the whole thing has to come off the books. There's no severability, which is the term here, which they usually can use to say, well, we'll get rid of the unconstitutional parts and keep the good stuff. But now the theory is the whole thing collapses if that goes down too. There's more, of course, but we're about to take our 2-minute break to catch our breath, finish up what is now lukewarm tea. It's peppermint tea. Kind of an interesting twist. Oh yes, and then we'll get back to the collapse of our republic after this and the peppermint tea. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Ah, yes. I forgot. Time to come back to the show. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. You know where you are. I don't need to remind you. I've already wasted that time. So we'll head back into the HuffPost piece on the Supreme Court and forget this whole thing happened. Okay, where were we? Yes, the legal theory of the plaintiffs includes a series of arguments that scholars from across the political spectrum have criticized and occasionally mocked. So, perfect for this purpose. How can there be a command to get insurance when the consequence for disobeying it is literally nothing? Do the people bringing the lawsuit even have standing to sue? There's standing again. One of the more confusing doctrines, but we've been over it. Do they have to? That's a good way to dismiss it, although I guess I would say it would be remarkable at this point for 4 justices to have said, yes, we should take the case, yes, we should hear it in this term, and yes, we should absolutely let everyone know that we're going to hear it and hear it in close proximity to the election, but right after the election, so that you can't vote on the basis of what we're about to do with this thing, only to end up saying, well, the whole thing doesn't matter anyway because there's no case here because these people don't have standing to sue. But it would be kind of right up their alley. It's a great escape clause. And I guess it's the sort of thing you would take up if you thought, yes, this Republican president will coast to re-election somehow because everybody loves Donald Trump and we'll take the case, but we won't hurt him by threatening pre-existing conditions in the entire Affordable Care Act and throwing everything into chaos before the election. We'll do it right after the election, but we'll rev up his base about how fun and exciting it's going to be to vote for him so that we can continue to pack the federal courts with people who hold out the prospect of sticking it to Obama one more time, and P.S. eliminating health care for 21 million people, which is awesome, and we love to do it. And then saying, oh, but if we change our minds and it actually ends up looking like Trump sucks and everybody hates him and he's going to lose in a landslide or whatever the situation may be, we can duck out of it after all by saying, oh, yeah, we just remembered this standing thing. And now we don't have to decide this case anymore. Okay, well, there's an even weaker argument out there, by the way. That's in the next paragraph. The one that has prompted so many of the law's critics to dismiss it is about a concept called severability. I knew that would be in here somewhere. Under a well-established doctrine, if there is such a thing, judges ruling part of a law unconstitutional are supposed to do minimal damage to the rest of the law if they can. The plaintiffs insist the entire statute has to go because that is what Congress intended. But it was Congress in 2017 that decided to zero out the mandate while fully aware that the rest of the Affordable Care Act would stay in place, you see. So how could they have meant for the whole thing to go down if they had the opportunity to instead repeal it, but didn't, instead zeroing out the mandate, knowing that the opportunity was hanging out there for them to vote to repeal the whole thing, but no such interest. So it's going to be a tough argument for them if logic is what drives these guys in the end. The plaintiffs insist the entire statute has to go because that's what Congress intended, right? More recently, I just read that, so we'll skip to more recently, some COVID-19 relief measures have extended or built upon part of the Affordable Care Act, which is yet more proof, as University of Connecticut professor John Cogan has argued, that Congress understood the law would stay in place and supports that. It's pretty good evidence. Meanwhile, the Affordable Care Act is actually functioning without a mandate penalty. That's one more reason to preserve the law, as a separate friend of the court brief from several dozen policy experts argues. One hint to how the Supreme Court might vote on this case comes from Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who in recent rulings indicated he supports the traditional notion of severability. That might suggest he's inclined to leave the rest of the Affordable Care Act in place, even if he buys the argument that the mandate has now become unconstitutional. And, yeah, I mean, I don't know, whatever. Maybe he goes that way with some sort of separate concurrence or something, but not that particularly interesting. Although the previous paragraph intrigued me just for a second. I mean, this is a very strong point, actually. The Affordable Care Act is currently, right now, actually functioning without a mandate penalty. So the severability, the severability argument that goes that this is such an integral part of the act that eliminating it means the rest simply can't stand because the whole thing is pegged to, based on there being this penalty. And in original thinking, I think that was true. Why would people buy insurance if they can't be denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions? Then the argument went, why would anybody buy insurance before the day they found out they needed it? Right? Why not just save all your premium money and then buy insurance later, since they can't say, you can't just come in here buying insurance as though you were healthy. You have a pre-existing condition that you're asking us to pay for. You have to have been paying a little bit all along the way in order for us to cover you. And the pre-existing condition protection wipes that out. The trade-off was we'll have a mandate so that everybody will have to pay that little bit along the way. Then we found out, well, we're going to take that away. And now people don't have to pay that little bit along the way. But won't that cause the whole system to collapse? Well, we thought so, but as it turns out, it hasn't. So you do have that argument, right? Where we say, well, severability says that the whole act has to go now that the mandate is unconstitutional because they can't work one without the other. And you'll be able to say, what explains it having worked for the past couple of years, one without the other? And they will say, I don't know. Magic, we find for the plaintiffs. That's an entirely possible outcome. Logic makes no difference when it comes to this stuff. Told you, quantum physics. Okay, where were we? Oh, yes, right. There was the hint about Kavanaugh maybe possibly believing in traditional severability and saying, yes, the mandate is unconstitutional. No, that doesn't mean you have to strike down the entire law. Could be. An answer Barrett gave at her confirmation hearing when the issue of Affordable Care Act came up repeatedly suggests that she, too, has a traditional view of severability, whatever that means. But there is no way to be sure, especially because her answer left some observers thinking she might agree with the plaintiffs on the rest of the argument. And the consequences of a decision going in the other direction, wiping out the Affordable Care Act, would be enormous. What would they be? The next section title tells us. Millions would lose insurance and insurance protections. The Affordable Care Act protects people with pre-existing conditions, mostly by prohibiting insurers from denying them coverage or charging them higher premiums. It also requires that all plans cover 10 essential benefits, including mental health, maternity care, and prescription drugs. If the Supreme Court strikes down the law, those protections disappear. But such a ruling would do much more. Yay, more damage. Today, Americans who buy insurance on their own can get tax credits if their income is below 4 times the poverty line, which is about $100,000 a year for a family of 4. Not the poverty line, but 4 times it, which really says something that we could probably spend a couple hours discussing another day. Those credits, though, the tax credits that you can get for buying insurance on your own, effectively discount premiums by hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars a year. They would be gone if the Affordable Care Act comes off the books, leaving millions to buy coverage on their own without that assistance. Some would still get insurance, and if they are young and healthy, they might even be able to get it more cheaply than they do now, but they would likely have less comprehensive coverage with big gaps in benefits. All the crap plans would come back. Many more Americans would lose Medicaid coverage because all but a dozen states have expanded eligibility to include everybody living below or just below the poverty line. Everybody living below, or just above the poverty line. I was wondering, why? That doesn't make any sense. Both of you are below. But I read it wrong. Providing coverage that's federally funded, of course. That federal funding comes from the Affordable Care Act, and it, too, would stop if the law is no longer in effect. States would have to quickly decide whether to continue covering some or all of these adults with their own funds. According to Judy Solomon, a senior fellow at the left-leaning Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, it's doubtful many would be able to do that. In some states, cuts would happen automatically because the executive actions or laws authorizing expansion call for restoring the pre-expansion eligibility standards if the extra federal funds stop flowing. Between the loss of tax credits and the end of Medicaid funding, 21 million people would lose insurance, according to estimates by the nonpartisan Urban Institute. A ruling against the law, this next section says, would unleash chaos. And who loves chaos? Donald Trump. Even that figure doesn't capture the full extent of the consequences from a Supreme Court decision against the health care law. The Affordable Care Act strengthened Medicaid by funding new home-based care options for the disabled and elderly. These initiatives would lose their authorization, leaving decisions about whether to continue the programs in the hands of cash-strapped state officials, sponsors, or private employer plans, through which roughly half of Americans get their insurance, could once again impose annual or lifetime limits on benefits. Since it's the Affordable Care Act that made such limits illegal. That could really hammer patients with rare forms of cancer or congenital conditions such as hemophilia, or any number of things, for which treatments can easily exceed $1 million per year, or even per month. Medicare recipients would also feel the effects. The Affordable Care Act bolstered it in several ways, most obviously by gradually eliminating a gap in the prescription drug coverage that became known as the donut hole. Without the Affordable Care Act in place, that gap would open back up, leaving seniors to pay more money for their drugs. And guess what? You're not getting that $200 discount card from Trump either. It's unclear how precisely that would work out because a law was enacted in 2018 to close the donut hole ahead of schedule. That legislation was a modification of the Affordable Care Act, and judges would have to sort out what that modification means if the ACA itself comes off the books. And that's just one example in which the courts would have to sort out modifications to the Affordable Care Act that Congress has passed since its inception. It's almost impossible to wrap your brain around how this would actually work, Sabrina Corlett, a research professor at Georgetown University, told HuffPost. It's almost like you'd need a special master to go through these changes line by line to figure out what's constitutional and what's not. It is almost like that. It's almost entirely like that. It is like that. And in the past, you might say that's such a daunting task that anybody wavering on what to do and ruling in this case would probably say, you know what, it's just best if we leave it in place because I don't want to have anything to do with sorting out that task, quite frankly. Like, members of Congress don't want to work on the continuing appropriations on a weekend. Supreme Court justices don't want this problem either. However, that's only because typically they and the presidents during whose terms in office they serve, or who may or may not have appointed them personally perhaps, also don't want chaos. You would have to sort all of this out in order to sort out the chaos and give answers to people about what's going to happen and what can and can't happen now under what remains of the law, if anything remains of the law, and what remains of the modifications that have been made. But if you only care about chaos, then you just say, well, I'm not going to do that job because I prefer the chaos, or the president to whom I answer prefers the chaos. And so it's really not any additional imposition of any work. I'm just not going to solve it. And, a person like that might come to a different conclusion. If there are any like that, we don't know. We just surmise that there may be. Likewise, a number of pilot programs to re-engineer Medicare payments for health care in order to improve the program's efficiency and promote better quality care are now underway. The experiments are taking place through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, which the Affordable Care Act authorizes and finances. Shutting the law down would mean shutting down the center and its programs, with unknown consequences for the healthcare providers participating in them. I don't even know what I'd tell a health system if they came to me asking what to do, said Nicholas Bagley, a professor of law at the University of Michigan, and who has a piece today that I declined to put aside on, describing this same chaos that might arise from striking down the law. Now at least we've heard from him in reading this other piece. And there would be effects that have nothing to do with health insurance. Let's read about that. The law is the reason that restaurant chains must post calorie counts on their menus, for example. It modified the Indian Health Service and changed the approval process for so-called biosimilar drugs. Well, okay, just a flat statement of these things. Then next, one sentence could make the case go away. Why don't we write that sentence? Healthcare policy is all about trade-offs, so for all these changes there would be counter effects, including a reduction in taxes on the wealthy that the Affordable Care Act raised to finance its coverage expansions. But the effects of invalidation of the ACA would be devastating to our entire healthcare system, said Timothy Jost, a law professor emeritus at Washington and Lee. Medicare payment rules, fraud and abuse prohibitions, we love them, Indian Health Service reforms, the Medicaid expansion, FDA authority over generic biologics, all would fall by the wayside, Jost said. Congress could always render the lawsuit moot by approving a one-sentence law, eliminating the language of the mandate, for example. So far, nobody has seriously tried to pass such a measure, and perhaps that has to do with the division between the two houses. Unless that changes, the outcome will now depend on the Supreme Court, where nothing is guaranteed. So there you have it. I guess you should now panic, and we'll find out how much, or whether perhaps it's unwarranted. I don't think so. when Joan visits us and gives us her take on what's going on here. And perhaps I should have saved this for her to discuss, but we'll just revisit it, and it'll be, this is an important topic. Spending the entire show on different angles of it, I think, not by any means a waste of time. It's a big deal. All right, let's see. Where were we here? Asparagus Zucchini makes this comment for us because we're a very serious show. We say it this way. If the GOP succeeds in destroying the healthcare infrastructure before the election, one option they had, would Biden be or have been forced to implement Medicare for all to cover the national emergency? Interesting. No. But there would certainly be perhaps a more widespread call for it. And the door would be open, and you'd say, well, one way of fixing this would be here. Now, I guess it's a thought, and it might be an interesting thought to Medicare for all proponents at the outset, although I guess I might say, isn't that something you might want to implement more deliberately and carefully? And the answer is probably yes, but maybe they'll take every opportunity or any opportunity they can get. I don't know. I can't answer for them. I'm not clear enough on how they would answer these questions. I just don't wrap myself up in the issue. I'll take it if they give it to me, I guess. This is how I'm looking at things. All right, let's see. Also, another note here, Kate Sherrill pointing our attention in a different direction here. I expect, she says, we'll see a lot more of this kind of thing before Trump leaves office. What is it? Raw Story covering this. Their headline, IRS erases Roger Stone's $1 million tax lien after Trump commutes prison sentence. Yes, I expect we'll see a lot more of this. That's true. I don't know if I really want to dive into that story right now, but be aware that that's hanging out there, and we might end up discussing it. Yes. Okay. Let's see. What other things? I know I've seen a couple of comments from others too that I can back up on now and take a look at. Okay. Yes. Brian Monroe sharing the Washington Post story, and I think that's sitting in pocket here too. What's the headline here? Stop the Steal supporters restrained by Facebook turn to Parler to peddle false election claims. Yes, the Phantom Zone, as I call it. Another right-wing alternative to Twitter where free speech is allowed because they're censoring us on Twitter. Come to Parler and you can say anything you want, which of course means it's a Nazi cesspool and no one's going to want to spend any time there. I love the fact that Parler exists. I don't want to see it stamped out because there have been a number of, ultra-conservative activists who say, well, that's it. I'm quitting Twitter and I'm going to Parler. I'm going to go into the forest where a tree, can fall, and we'll find out whether, if no one's around, it makes a sound because there's no one there. I mean, to literally create a right-wing echo chamber that no one but the most dedicated right-wing activist would spend any time in, I guess, except, I suppose, left-wing activists who want to demonstrate just what a cesspool Parler is. They might go there and screenshot things and bring them back to Twitter and say, look what terrible things are being said over there, which may also be the aim of the right-wing activists who say, I'm being censored on Twitter and I can't get my message out on Twitter, so what I'll do is I'll go over here on Parler and post it there, and then well-meaning left-wing activists, to show how disgusting I am, will take a picture of what I said and then post it over on Twitter, and then my message will get out on Twitter. I don't know. I don't know if they think that far ahead. But, but by the way, Parler just sort of joining. It's a long tradition of, oh yeah, they're censoring me, so I'm going to build my own. There was a right-wing YouTube. There was a right-wing Wikipedia. Remember Conservapedia? There's a right-wing, or 10 or 15 right-wing Act Blues, and none of them work. Red State was supposed to be the right-wing Daily Kos, and that didn't really do anything. So, just one in a series of similar ideas that go nowhere. Let's see. We also had Patrick Snyder had shared a couple of things two in particular over the last couple of hours of yesterday. One on what the DOJ is up to, and a take on what the DOJ has been up to lately from Vanita Gupta, but then a interesting counterpoint that he shares from someone else here. Who's the other person? Alexandra Aaron on Twitter. Interesting thoughts. And yeah, we haven't really discussed much of what the DOJ is up to. And I think, I don't know if I'm ready to pronounce what I think can or can't come of this, but the DOJ under Bill Barr, I guess, apparently, I just don't know what to make of this memo, but issuing a memo to federal prosecutors, and I guess it really just depends on how you read this thing, authorizing, I guess, federal prosecutors to pursue voter fraud or other elections cases and disputed elections if they think these cases, bear merit. But I mean, didn't they already have that authority? I mean, generally speaking, they didn't have that authority. If you think a case has merit, you pursue it. There was another aspect of the memo, which the DOJ, you remember back in the days when they used to have internal rules about whether or not they could take up various kinds of cases in close proximity to an election because it could, possibly color the outcome, and you want to avoid that. But then that went out the window. Jim Comey, etc., and then Barr, for months has been saying, yeah, we're not going to be constrained by anything like that. Part of this memo is we're no longer going to be constrained about changing the outcome of elections if we think there's merit to these voter fraud cases. So, anyway, I'll give you the update on this. The New York Times covered this story. Barr hands prosecutors the authority to investigate voter fraud claims. So the straight up reporting of what happened here, with whatever, New York Times twist as usual. The Attorney General said that he had authorized, quote, instances of investigative steps, but that inquiries should not be based on specious claims. Well, no crap. Anyway, Katie Benner and Michael Schmidt wrote this piece, published yesterday. Barr, wading into President Trump's unfounded accusations of widespread election irregularities, told federal prosecutors on Monday that they were allowed to investigate specific allegations of voter fraud before the results of the presidential race are certified. Mr. Barr's authorization prompted the Justice Department official who oversees investigations of voter fraud, whose name is Richard Pilger, I guess, unless it's Pilger, Pilger, to step down from the post within hours, according to an email Mr. Pilger sent to colleagues that was obtained by the New York Times. Barr said he had authorized specific instances of investigative steps in some cases. He made clear that in a carefully worded memo that prosecutors had the authority to investigate, but warned that specious, speculative, fanciful, or far-fetched claims should not be a basis for initiating federal inquiries. So it's a question of what the hell does that mean? Is it just CYA language like, pursue whatever you want. Just remember that if we ever get called out and you have to justify it, you're going to have to say that, it wasn't specious, speculative, fanciful, or far-fetched, so I pursued it. Now, was it any of those things? Yes, but I'm going to say that I believe that it wasn't, and that could be enough. Others are pointing to this thing and saying it's no more authority than they've ever had, so what's the big deal? So we have yet to see how this is going to be interpreted. It's just a document you can see anything you want in, and sometimes this is the most dangerous kinds. Mr. Barr's directive ignored the Justice Department's longstanding policies intended to keep law enforcement from affecting the outcome of an election, and it followed a move weeks before the election in which the department lifted a prohibition on voter fraud investigations before an election. Let me just pause here to make this point. It might have confused you briefly in thinking about this. The directive ignored a longstanding Justice Department policy intended to keep law enforcement from affecting the outcome of an election, which we usually expressed in terms of doing something in close proximity, that is to say, right before an election, releasing a letter about reopening an investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, for instance, or some such thing. In past years, it's been about announcing investigations into, let's say, for an example, Bob Menendez in New Jersey, suspected or accused of some certain malfeasance, and they didn't really want to take that up because it was within a certain amount of time of an election in which he stood for re-election, and they waited until afterwards. It happens all the time, and yes, we understand the guidelines, and normally it's interpreted that way. You don't do it right before an election. But you might be saying to yourself, it is now after an election. So what's the story? And here you are back in the gray zone, the quantum constitutional law zone, in which we realize that, of course, in the view of the Justice Department, which knows and understands the quantum physics of high constitutional law, the fact that the election is over isn't what we're interested in. It's you can still affect the outcome of an election because the counting and certification aren't done. And you are still essentially in that pre-election moment, even though election day has come and gone. And election day has become a nebulous concept anyway, but you thought it was only because there was early voting. Well, guess what? There's also late voting, except not really, although it could be late voting if you were listening to Eric Trump or the Trump campaign, for instance, in Pennsylvania, pushing you to pick up an absentee ballot, even if you've already voted at the polls, and try and send one of those in too, just to see if you can catch anybody in the act of catching you at committing voter fraud. All right, let's see. I'm a little bit behind on the music here. And so we'll take an awkward exit from here just so that we keep our marks on time. Give me extra time to go clear my throat for 1 minute and come back and tell you the rest of the story about what's going on with the Justice Department. And perhaps some time to peek into the other takes on it, and then a quick survey around for other stories. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Again, coming in at a weird place in the music. I almost forgot that we were going out at a weird place in the music at the outset of this break. But here we are. All right, so much more to this story about Barr and what he's up to. And perhaps that, too, might be something that Joan might be interested in discussing. But I wanted to get the basics of it out there. There's some really interesting details as you go down the line about some of the individual cases and some of the various states where the votes may be challenged. But I think the key takeaway was, 1, that there was this weird memo written, 2, that you can interpret it any way you like, 3, that's a particularly dangerous thing to do, 4, it caused the head of the section at DOJ that ordinarily deals with such cases to quit, but just quit as section chief. He has not left the Department of Justice entirely. I guess it's not that egregious. He just didn't want his name on these things, which is supposed to be a signal to the rest of us that something serious is going on. And we'll have to, I guess, see in the next coming days and weeks just what that signal was supposed to be and how serious the goings-on really are. A couple of other related items are out there, and that I thought I would share, and I guess some disparate, unrelated items too. I'm just going to have to leap around in Pocket and get them to you. Here's something that Greg wanted to share yesterday and sent over our way after his segment of the show was over. He pointed me to the tweet of Matt Glassman. Tweets as Matt Glassman 312, by the way, because that stands for assault rifle. This I thought was kind of interesting. The institutionalist in me, says Matt Glassman, who is an institutionalist, I guess, senior fellow at GAI Georgetown. I don't know what that is. It escapes me off the top of my head, but hey, Georgetown, think tank. What else do you want to know? Put it this way. The institutionalist in me loves that there's a meaningful legal distinction between the statutory president-elect, whom you and I both recognize as being Joe Biden. But this statutory president-elect is a personage determined. This is the one determined by the GSA, who is supposed to issue that letter saying this person and their office gets money to help fund the transition between the presidencies here, as determined by GSA under 3 U.S. Code Section 102, or at least a note to Section 102. But what thrills Matt here is that there's a difference between the statutory president-elect and the constitutional president-elect as determined by the Electoral College. That is, as we were discussing yesterday, might the GSA not get away, if they wanted to, with saying there cannot be a transition until the Electoral College votes, or perhaps until the vote of the Electoral College is counted in Congress and certified as true and correct, and at that point, Joe Biden would become the president-elect, January 6th, and not any time sooner than that. Or do you rely on statutory interpretation? 3 U.S. Code Section 102 seems to suggest that at least for purposes of spending money through the GSA, the person who's presumed to have won the election can be called president-elect. It's another reminder, he continues here, that many, perhaps most, of the powers of the modern president are derived not from the Constitution, but from grants of power from Congress. The president, left only to his constitutional authority, is really pretty weak. Or, in this case, the constitutional president-elect, which Biden won't be until the electors meet, doesn't have much in the way of resources unless he or she is also the statutory president-elect, which Biden won't be until the GSA confirms the election victory. You see the bridge from yesterday's discussion? In my opinion, the GSA administrator should not simply follow the network calls and might reasonably wait for state certification and or legal challenges. However, it'd be crazy to allow the GSA administrator to deny statutory president-elect status to the constitutional president-elect. I don't know if anybody's suggesting that or not, but okay. Therefore, if the GSA administrator tried to prevent the transition funds from being released after the electors vote on 12/14, his interpretation of when you become constitutional president-elect, although again, I'd say, I'm a stickler for the paperwork, right? So the procedural, what did he call himself up here? The institutionalist in me loves that there's this distinction. The institutionalist in me says, you say the Electoral College met and voted, but Congress doesn't care until January 6th. That's the point at which we count the thing. I mean, the fact that you mailed in your absentee ballot on October 3rd doesn't mean the election's over. For you it is, but, we still have to apparently wait until November 3rd to start counting, and even then, we don't know the answer of who won until 12/14. But, I say you don't know the answer until those envelopes are opened on January 6th. Quantum differences here that we have. Okay, where were we? Right, it'd be crazy to allow the GSA to deny statutory president-elect status to the constitutional president-elect. Therefore, if the GSA administrator tried to prevent transition funds from being released after the 12/14 Electoral College vote, that'd be a clear sign that Congress needs to rewrite the law to make it clear the funds go even without GSA support once there's a constitutional president-elect. And it's worth remembering that Biden is currently neither the constitutional nor statutory president-elect. It's fine to use that as a colloquial shorthand, but his current status is probably best described as presumptive president-elect. Or if it was Trump, we would say purported president-elect. It's an interesting perspective. Don't know what to do with it exactly, but again, I guess I include it in the roundup here just by way of trying to illustrate my concept of this gray area of constitutional law and quantum physics as a analogy. All right, let's see. What other things have we got to point at? Oh, yes. Well, just a quick item here from Mark Elias, election case lawyer extraordinaire, pointing out, hey, look how the Trump week in court begins. Out in Michigan, the Court of Appeals, to which the Trump team turned after losing in their initial trial court effort to try and raise objections to the Michigan vote, whatever their objections were. Copy of the letter from the Court of Appeals that addressed to the Trump campaign. This office has received your papers in the above captioned matter. It's Donald J. Trump for President Incorporated versus Secretary of State. I regret to inform you that your submission is defective because it was not accompanied by the following. And guess what the problem is? It's paperwork. What was missing? Well, a copy of the judgment or order appealed from under the Michigan Code, and they give you the numbers and everything, but that won't matter for our purposes. A copy of the Register of Actions, that is the lower court docket entries. A copy of the transcript or evidence that the transcript has been ordered, and 5 copies of a brief conforming to the requirements of the Michigan Code. And basically what that all comes down to is this. You have arrived at the Court of Appeals saying, we want to file an appeal of a case we lost below in the trial court. And the Court of Appeals says, no problem. We understand people want to do that sort of thing all the time. What case are you appealing? And can you give me a copy of it? And show me that you lost and what your appeal is about and how did the case go? And they're like, no, we can't. Or we could, but we didn't. And this will happen from time to time when you're moving rapidly through the court system. But, one of the things you kind of have to do is wait for that paper to get issued. And if they're dragging their feet, you might perhaps apply under some emergency circumstances and say, we believe the court below is actually dragging their feet on this, and you have the power to order them to hand over our paperwork that will satisfy your initial requirement. But just once again, another Trump and paperwork, man, moment. You say you're appealing a case. Prove to me that there was a case, essentially. So I'm not because I don't believe you necessarily, but because I need to put this thing on the docket. What are you appealing? Show me that this case happened. You can't just come to an appeals court and say, well, we want to get to the Supreme Court of the United States or the Supreme Court of Michigan fast. So we didn't bother with a trial. We're just appealing it, figuring we'll lose. You can't do that. There has to be a case that you're appealing, and you have to show them what it is. It's pro forma stuff. They just didn't do it. So interesting. And again, I did see some practitioners saying, when you're working on an emergency basis and moving that quickly, sometimes the paperwork doesn't catch up and it's not necessarily your fault, but you still are responsible for telling them that it's coming or where it's coming from or pointing them to something to convince them that a case happened here. But they didn't do it. All right, let's see. What other things have we to discuss? Oh, this one maybe we can save for discussion with Joan. We'll see if she's interested in this, but many people discussing the what ifs of what if McConnell decides, if he still has a majority in the Senate or something near enough to a majority to make it work, what if he decides he's simply not going to allow, just like with Merrick Garland, no discussions, no hearings, no votes on any Joe Biden appointments, not just appointments to the federal bench, but any kind, like we're not going to let him have a cabinet kind of thing. I guess that would bring us to an interesting discussion of how important is it that there be a cabinet anyway? Like, there's nothing that the Senate could do to prevent a person who is president from talking to or taking advice from anybody that he wants, essentially, whether they're reviewed by the Senate and approved as Secretary of Commerce, let's say, or not. But of course, we've also discussed how much of our law is built on the assumption that there will be confirmed secretaries in this space. And there are lots of powers that the Congress has delegated to the various department heads that require that the decision be made or a conclusion be reached by a person serving in the role of secretary. And yeah, there are some allowances for when there's a vacancy there and an acting secretary is working, but if nobody is ever approved, I don't know if it really works that way. But I guess we might find out in the near future. My prediction, by the way, is that McConnell will happily get out of the way of any sitting Democratic senators that Biden would like to remove from the Senate by appointing them to the cabinet or other high office, and he will happily move those along. And he'll say so. He'll say that it's not about removing Democrats from the Senate, even ones who sit in representation of states where there are Democratic governors, and we should all anticipate that they would be replaced with other Democrats. And that's likely the case. Why would McConnell care about that? Well, it doesn't. It's not going to change his numbers, for one thing, and for another, setting up a special election between an anointed and appointed Democrat in XYZ state versus a legitimate Republican who's totally, going to take his case directly to the people first is not a bad matchup. They might get crushed in it because of the nature of the voters in that state, but whatever. He'll take the opportunity. But he'll be saying, appointing a Democratic senator is a very different thing. All of our Republican senators are familiar with them. They've worked with them as colleagues. They'll be comity and reaching across the aisle and will approve that person. And traditionally, it's been very easy to get sitting senators approved for these positions for that reason. And he'll say it's that, and totally not about only approving appointments when it will give him the possibility of some advantage down the road in the Senate numbers. But we'll see how many such people he taps. There are many ways to change the makeup of the Senate. The special elections in Georgia coming to mind immediately. We can talk about what it means to have a 50-50 Senate, should that be the case. And it's happened in recent memory, and there are interesting precedents for how to approach such a thing. I just also hold out the possibility, given that we saw another super spreader event held at the White House on election night, that one other thing that can reshape the shape, that's true, I said it, of the Senate is elderly Republican senators from states with Democratic governors who happen to find themselves at a super spreader event, contract COVID, and nature takes its course. And, I'm not saying it would be a good thing if that happened. I'm saying it would be an interesting thing if that happened. Interesting is good. So I am saying it would be a good thing by logical extension, but I'm not saying it directly, and that's the point. Also, no one's listening who would likely get us in trouble, so you can say those things. But now someone will circulate the tape, and I'm covered because I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's interesting, and although interesting is good, it's not always good in the same way. Okay, fine. Now, that's a great explanation. I can now get a job explaining to President Trump, purportedly President Trump, why we effed up and had a press conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping. They're still sticking to that story. They're still insisting, no, we meant to put it here. Not just because, we screwed up and we can't move it now because the press will become confused and they won't be able to find us, but because this was they're sticking to the story of this was a secure location because of the razor wire on top of the chain link fence and easy on off from the highway. Everybody who covered the event, by the way, had to get in their cars or rent cars from downtown Philadelphia where they were staying and drive out to this bizarro location. There's no way in hell they did it there on purpose. And by the way, we should just say at the outset, my suspicion is that it is that weird 20-something not yet graduated from college gal Friday that Rudy Giuliani keeps around. Christiane Allen, remember her? My guess is just, they're in the limo from wherever they were coming from to get to Philly, and he says, call the Philly Four Seasons and tell them we want to have a press conference. And she just Googles it on the phone and calls the first place and has no idea that, there could be such a place that's not the Four Seasons Hotel. She may not even know what the Four Seasons Hotel is, for all I know. Okay. Well, anyway, Let's see. Other items up for discussion. Oh, yes, Mike Musson commenting here on something we commented on via Twitter earlier today. Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post saying, as an ex-president, Trump could disclose the secrets he learned while in office, presuming he learned anything while in office. Current and former officials fear. And that is a good fear, but I don't know that Mike makes a good point here. I don't think we should assume that he's kept any secrets at all. Very good point. He hasn't to date. He's spilled the beans every opportunity he's had. I will point out, though, that there are probably some other secrets, maybe of other governments, that he may have, that other governments might fear he would spill. And I did comment, one of the ways that he could be kept from spilling state secrets is if he fell out a window in Kyiv, which is a preferred method used by a different government, not ours, but whose secrets he may be in possession of, or whose influence he may be aware of and might blab about for some stupid reason. And, I'm not saying, I was wondering about this. Was this the sort of thing that somebody would think is a threat to say, well, unless he falls out a window in Kyiv? It is a threat. It's just not me threatening him. It would be the Russian government threatening them. And are we not, as patriotic Americans, worried about the possibility of a hostile Russian nation or any other quasi-enemy, if you don't want to believe them, an actual enemy, the threat that they pose to our presidents and ex-presidents? I thought we guarded against that at great expense every day, because you never know when something like that might happen. So anyway, it's just out there. Another item up for consideration. Let's see. Other news worth sharing. Here's something of some interest. This one struck me as out of the blue, but we might as well start talking about it, given that there are runoff elections in Georgia, for instance. Another good topic. Happen to see this on Tegan Goddard's Political Wire. Republicans are about to raise your taxes. Not a headline you see discussed all that often, although it's very often true. What's he talking about? Borrowing from Joseph Stiglitz here in the New York Times, the blurb that Tegan has taken here goes like this. The Trump administration has a dirty little secret. Oh, so many, in fact. It's not just planning to increase taxes on most Americans. You would think that this is maybe something that they couldn't get done in the 2 months that they have left at the end of the year, right? But and yet, here it is. Let's see. The increase has already been signed, sealed, and delivered. So it's not even a plan at this point. It just is. Buried in the pages of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. President Trump and his congressional allies hoodwinked us, the next part says here. The law they passed initially lowered taxes for most Americans, but it built in automatic stepped tax increases every 2 years that begin in 2021 and that by 2027 would affect nearly everyone but the people at the top of the economic hierarchy. Why? Why not the top? All taxpayer income groups with incomes of $75,000 and under, and that's about 65% of taxpayers, will face a higher tax rate in 2027 than they did in 2019. This feels like something we need to learn a little bit more about. The piece in question in the New York Times runs under the title of Republicans, not Biden, are about to raise your taxes. Stiglitz is identified here as in case you don't know, a university professor at Columbia, which would make him a professor at Columbia University, how most people would say it, and a Nobel laureate in economics. So that's something that Donald Trump isn't. Just wanted to point that out. This is an October 31st piece, and we missed it. It's about the dirty little secret, and the 2 paragraphs read before the 2 leads on this one, so we can continue down here. For most, in fact, it's a delayed tax increase dressed up as a tax cut. Some disguise, right? How many times have you heard Trump and his allies mention that? They surmised, correctly so far, that if they waited to add the tax increases until after the 2020 election, few of the people most affected were likely to remember who was responsible. I didn't remember that it existed at all, but I have a good guess as to who's responsible. Looking at the analyses of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation at the time the December 2017 tax bill was enacted, we see very clearly how different income groups are affected by the Trump tax plan. And it's disturbing. And it's disturbing that nobody discussed it prior to the election, but there were so many other bedrock issues. It really didn't matter for most people. The taxes might go up, but I guess it could affect things at the margins. And this was all about the margins, this election. So it is a little weird. The current poverty line, he continues, for a family of four is $26,200. People with incomes between $10,000 and $30,000, nearly 1/4 of Americans, are among those scheduled to pay a higher average tax rate in 2021 than in years before the tax cut, in quotes, was passed. The CBO and Joint Committee estimated that those with an income of $20,000 to $30,000 would owe an extra $365 next year, $1 for every time Trump played golf, I think. These are people who are struggling to pay rent and put food on the table. Of course, the poor have never mattered much to the Republican Party, but those on the edge of poverty have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic and the recession it has caused, so Trump's planned tax increases seem especially heartless and impractical when you consider that their higher tax payments, while a huge burden for them, will add little to the budget. But then again, what does he care? Because he's out of here, right? By 2027, wherein he'd pretty much be out of here even if he had won re-election, when the law's provisions are set to be fully enacted, with the stealth tax increases complete, the country will be neatly divided into two groups. Those making over $100,000 will on average get a tax, what? Right, tax cut. Those earning under $100,000, an income bracket encompassing 3/4 of taxpayers, will not. At the same time, Trump has given his peers, people with annual incomes in excess of $1 million, or the top 0.3% of the country, a huge gift. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimated the average tax rate in 2019 for this group to be 2.3 percentage points lower than before the tax cut, saving the average taxpayer in this group over $64,000, more than the average American family makes in a year. That's just your tax savings. The tax loss and benefit estimates just described were calculated before the pandemic. Now, incomes for almost everyone but the top earners have taken a hit, so the loser group will likely be considerably larger than anticipated. And with people like Jeff Bezos, the billionaire chief executive of Amazon, and the owner of that other paper, doing even better than expected, Trump's gift to him is even bigger. This analysis makes clear that the vast majority of Americans will be better off with the likely tax reforms that will emerge from a Biden administration than they would be by sticking with Mr. Trump's ill-conceived tax bill. You might well ask, why didn't Mr. Trump just give everyone a tax cut? Right? Everyone. The Republicans, who suddenly lost their grasp on their self-described fiscal conservatism when they came into office in 2017, saw a chance to give their rich friends and corporations a big thank you for campaign contributions. But the tax cuts they promised these donors produced projections that the resulting budget deficits were well beyond $1 trillion. Well, to reduce that stomach-churning amount, they had to phase in higher taxes on ordinary Americans. While this kind of budget gimmickry has been used before, think the last Republican president, George W. Bush, Trump carried it to a new level. The Republicans have one more feeble defense, their old friend trickle-down economics. The tax cut to the corporations would, they promised, trickle down to citizens at the bottom of the income ladder. We have now seen how that hasn't happened again, I add. In fact, the money gushed up to those at the very top in the form of stockholder dividends, chief executive bonuses, and a record level of stock buybacks, nearly $1 trillion in 2018 alone. Some economic models predicted the Trump tax law would lead to significantly higher wages because of more investment and higher growth. But projections showed that when the 2017 bill's temporary tax cuts changed to tax increases, growth would likely slow significantly and wage increases would be anemic. And those calculations were made again before the pandemic hit. Well, there's more to it here. Let's just continue on right up to the break. Mark Zandi and Bernard Yaros of Moody's Analytics have done the most credible and thorough analysis comparing the Biden and Trump plans, including Mr. Trump's stealth increases and other promised tax and expenditure changes. Mr. Biden's plan wins by an enormous margin. 7.4 million more jobs and a much quicker recovery from this recession. That means higher wages and incomes for most Americans. Elections matter. Maybe, sorta, kinda. Elections gave Republicans the power to enact these tax shenanigans. Neither conscience nor principles stopped them. And there's a concluding paragraph for which I will not have time. Perhaps we'll discuss it after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to Patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Joan has joined us, and we were just having a little discussion in the background and realizing one thing, the big shortcoming of the Stiglitz article here is that at no point in the article does he remind us of the name. Here it is. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I skipped right over that because I guess that was in the summary where I found it in the Political Wire, and then I didn't read it a second time. But, yeah, we were realizing my memory of it, and maybe yours too, Joan, is not that clear. I'm sure at the time we were probably told in the various packets of analysis of how terrible this whole thing was, that one of the real problems with it is that it pays for tax cuts for the rich. I mean, this will sound familiar. It pays for tax cuts with the rich with back-end later tax hikes for everybody else. I mean,
yes,
sounds like
I do
something
remember that
did.
Actually. I remember seeing charts about it.
Yes, and that's the sort of thing that in the moment, I'm sure we probably said to ourselves, well, everyone will see through this charade. You can't just cut taxes for supposedly everybody right now and pay for it by keeping the tax cuts for rich people later, but then reversing the tax cuts and turning them into tax hikes for everybody else below $100,000 in a couple of years, just because there'll be an election interceding. People will remember these shenanigans. And the true answer is that no, they won't. Even we won't. Stiglitz will, and I guess that's good. We'll read Stiglitz, no one else will, and so we'll be reminded. And, Trump voters who will be hit by these tax increases will say, you must be thinking of the Biden tax increases because Trump left. Remember?
Right.
Yeah, so good design. I mean, evil genius. What can you do? I mean, he's not.
It's an argument for Biden and hopefully having the Democratic Senate in January to repeal the tax scam.
Yeah, that's the final paragraph that I didn't get to of this piece. It's just basically what you just said. Well, the hope is that Democrats will win a majority in the two houses and have the presidency and the tools they need to undo it. And, well, I hope so. There's still a chance.
As always, it's a thin reed to attach your hopes to.
Right. So now we have two special elections that are, maybe going to take care of this. Although, I've heard nothing from Alaska, but I don't know.
Oh, yeah, there's still Alaska.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Alaska's weird. They could do anything. They have.
There's still 50% of the vote out, as far as I know.
There was some enormous...
Al Gross is really bullish on his chances. I am less so, I think.
That's his job, is to be bullish on his chances. So,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing to imagine that, oh, hey, Democratic senator from Alaska. It's happened in recent memory.
Well, it would be independent, but
yes,
Democratic. Right. 58% of the vote is in, and he is down 30 points.
That's a lot. But, you know, there aren't a lot of people in Alaska, which is weird. You know, how come it takes so long? There aren't very many people. There's 400 miles apart.
Flying ballots in from...
Right. The internet is frozen.
Little string of islands that stretch out. From everywhere.
So there you go. A pretty solidly Republican state that just takes forever to count its votes, and we don't know why, and it must be shenanigans. It's a far-flung place. An enormous far-flung place. All right, but yeah, so I think the conventional wisdom, generally speaking, is, I don't think we're going to win Alaska, so it looks like it comes down to the two Georgia specials, about which there's perhaps more hope to be optimistic, more reason to be optimistic.
I think there's more reason to be optimistic. Although taking both is
that's
a tall order.
Yes, right. Oh, jinx. Yeah, same thing. I would say that's tough. And the history of these Georgia runoffs, Louisiana runoffs, all the weird states that do these things, is that, you know, when there are, particularly if there's a crowded field, because it's a special election runoff, as in the case of Loeffler's, I don't know, I was going to say Loeffler's seat, but it's not hers, the one she was given.
The one she was given.
Then you have the vote split among a number of people, and then when it's just down to one Democrat and one Republican and it's all on the line, Georgia tends to come home, except we just found out that they moved into a new home in the presidential election.
Thank you, Stacey Abrams.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes. So,
and you still got Trump out there saying you can't trust elections.
Yeah.
You can't. There's.
He's really
I don't
trying.
know which base gets more excited. I have a feeling that the Democratic base continues to stay very excited.
Yeah. I hope so.
But if you've got a bunch of Republicans thinking they're stealing it, does that make them stay home or does that make them turn out?
I don't know. It's difficult to tell. And I think recently the answer has been it makes them turn out. You know, record numbers of Republicans turned out this time. The big repudiation of Trump that we were hoping to get instantly and immediately. I mean, it is still developing and it is still there. I mean, he lost this election by huge numbers, but yes, they exceeded we exceeded all of our targets. So did they. And,
it was two waves crashing together.
So they will be out. And, you know, meanwhile, of course, people who are, you know, maybe even out of an abundance of caution, raising alarms about what shenanigans can still happen and what trouble Trump can still cause and just what kind of a constitutional crisis he might be able to trigger, that should, you know, motivate the Democratic base in Georgia to say, you know, we're called upon once again to save the country here. We just did it. It's not that far off. We can sustain this momentum. But at the same time, the Democratic punditry seems determined to insist that all of these alarm bells that you're ringing you're triggering fear. You're doing exactly the wrong thing. We need to tell everybody everything's going to be okay so that the alarmist wave in Republican Georgia meets a complacent napping wave in Democratic Georgia, and that is how we will win. And I don't know if I understand that strategy.
No, I've never understood that strategy.
Happy people love to come out and vote twice in a 2-month period.
I have a feeling Trump's just not going to let us say that anyway.
Well, so
I
thanks,
mean, you know,
Trump.
firing his defense secretary,
yes,
not letting the GSA move forward with the transition. All of the things he's doing are showing he is exceedingly extreme, and he's got Bill Barr and Mitch McConnell backing him up.
Yep. Yeah.
So a lot of really very scary things can happen in the next 71 days.
Right. That's true. And if you
72? How many days?
People were throwing around the number 72 about 2 days ago. So let's say about 70 now. I don't know offhand. Somebody else knows. Yeah, Mark Knoller, if you care, ask him. He'll count for you. But about that much. And I don't know. Maybe secret tax increases will motivate you to get it. I don't know. I think you'll ring all the alarm bells you can, and talk to as many Georgians as you can if you have that opportunity. We mentioned earlier and discussed a little bit about what Bill Barr is up to. I'm not sure what's on your mind chiefly today. Is it the fact that we're running out of government money again? Is it the ACA case?
That's always a concern. The Affordable Care Act case, of course.
Okay, yes, right.
Because here we go again. And what that bodes in one of the Pennsylvania election challenges when you're looking at the Supreme Court.
Okay.
The very fact that they are hearing this really, really, really flimsy challenge is disturbing.
The ACA challenge.
The ACA challenge, that it advanced this far.
Yes. I get where you're going, I think.
On the ACA challenge, I think still we're probably safe. I really just have a hard time seeing them. I don't know if it's going to be Kavanaugh Gorsuch. Roberts will probably vote with the liberals. Maybe both Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. Gorsuch has been willing to overturn Trump stuff before to stand up to Trump.
Okay.
Kavanaugh has written so extensively on severability and the caution courts have to have in overreaching on striking down entire laws that it would have. I mean, does he have any integrity? Does he have any judicial philosophy? I don't know, but those are the things to look at.
Yeah,
anyway, the case got this far. They're hearing it. There's one of the Pennsylvania challenges that's disturbing to me, that bothers me a lot, that Alito has already sort of rubber stamped and said, okay, we're going to do this, as has Kavanaugh. And that's a Republican state legislature having supremacy over a state Supreme Court on election laws.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. It wasn't just an invention from, state level people or cabinet or campaign operatives. It was a Supreme Court justice recently said, that's the way it works.
So that's the one thing in all of this ridiculousness, because really all of the cases that the Trump campaign is bringing are specious. They're ridiculous. They're being laughed out of court. But that was not being laughed at by the Supreme Court, or at least by Alito and Kavanaugh.
They don't get the joke, I guess.
Of course, that has, very serious implications for the future of voting rights in Republican states.
Yeah, like you might not have any. Not necessary. It's not that you don't have the right to vote. Anybody can vote, just we have to hold an election in order for to do it. And for president, we might not do it.
And the second scary implication is that, yes, the U.S. Supreme Court would intervene over a state Supreme Court on an issue that is supposed to be solely in the hands of the states. Election procedures.
Yes. Local folks know best unless they don't.
Right. States' rights, unless not.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder about Kavanaugh and his severability writings. Like, I guess it makes a difference. For instance, was he defending a robust doctrine of severability because there was a Republican priority being struck down in law, like where they were striking down the Religious Freedom Act, and now we need severability to save certain elements of this thing, or does it really apply across the board?
Right.
A democratic law, I don't care so much about severability there.
Which would be entirely predictable.
Yeah.
But then there's the other part. They're hearing this in the middle of a pandemic.
Yes, that too.
And they have to realize the implications of getting rid of what is now our basic healthcare system because it is so ingrained into how everything works in our system now. Are they really, really so much in a bubble that they don't see what would happen with that? Do they care?
Yeah. Do they think it's a virtue to say, without fear or favor, I stand for the majesty of the law, and I'm sorry that this is happening, but the law is the law, and you can't blame me. They do sometimes. I think they feel that way sometimes.
I think they feel that way sometimes. So this is all really quite disquieting this morning.
Yes. Well, okay. Well, you'll all feel better knowing that you depend on Chief Justice Roberts to tell Amy Coney Barrett, you see, the way we do things here is, to which she may say, don't mansplain the Supreme Court to me. I clerked here, and I know what goes on, and you can't sway me. Or she may say, I understand. You're asking for my team cooperation. I'm on your team. Yes, I can do that in this case. Just don't ask me on some of the things I've actually written about before. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, it's very worrisome, and we won't know, of course, what happens today. It's not like Trump envisions the elections that tonight by midnight the TV will tell us who won the case.
And it's who won on Tuesday night.
Right.
That's it.
That's right.
Any vote counted doesn't count. It's fraudulent.
Yeah, actually,
speaking of which, they're trying to throw out basically the entirety of Pennsylvania. Just say don't certify. You can't do it. Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. No Pennsylvania.
Take them out of the electoral vote. Take them out of it's 518 now instead of 538.
Right.
Nate has to change the name of his site.
The problem being that even if they get rid of the entirety of Pennsylvania, to win, Trump would also have to get one of the other big ones, or, two of the medium-sized ones. He can't. He can't.
Yeah, not in any real way. Yeah, I don't know how you engineer it.
And how you know that these are just a nuisance while he drags it along to, I don't know, to intimidate people, try to get faithless electors. I don't know what the end game is.
Yeah,
I don't think his lawyers know what the end game is because they didn't really have lawyers until Friday. They just had Rudy.
Right. And the guy who was supposed to hire him got COVID.
That they're using, like in Arizona, they're talking about fraud on 180 ballots in Maricopa County.
Okay. And then what?
And then what?
Yeah, it was 180 ballots. I mean, press the case, and that I get that's the disguise that Mitch McConnell is wearing. Well, you press your legal rights. You're allowed to do that. Many people speculating that he's giving Trump room to run in the hopes that it will generate excitement for those runoff elections in Georgia, perhaps. I don't know, but so Arizona doesn't work out for them really either. They're just going to stomp and insist on it on principle. We want to contest those 180 ballots. And
you talked about the problem in their Michigan suit that they're just trying to bring. That was another Giuliani brain fart. Where they filed an appeal and they didn't file any of the paperwork necessary to appeal.
Yeah. They're just appeal. I don't know that there was even a case. They just we're just here. You're a higher court. So they're not good.
They're filing cases based on secondhand hearsay from Post-it notes. I mean, really.
A little bit of everything.
It's entirely nuisance suits just trying to drag this along because Trump won't quit.
Yeah. And I saw the clip from the piece that everyone was circulating yesterday about, I guess, some senior administration official saying, well, what's the harm in humoring the old man for a little while until he goes? And of course, that's how we, got here. But that's a weird take, certainly. And I'd be interested to know who said that. It was probably Ivanka. And I don't know. Not sure. They've got a new suit in Pennsylvania. I understand they filed a new one claiming that there's an equal protection problem. That they say you handled mailed ballots differently than day of election day live in person ballots, and you can't handle things in two separate ways, which is a little reminiscent of the Bush v. Gore suit,
A
I guess.
little, but they did it because, I mean, they could just point back to Alito and say, well, he told us to.
Yeah, right. Me, I didn't. No, I didn't. Hiding under
Which
the
they
desk.
were already doing. I mean, what
Yeah.
Alito did was not necessary because they were already segregating those ballots because they knew they were going to be subject to these challenges. But
Right.
those ballots, I think so far, there are 71 counties in Pennsylvania. I think I just wrote this. And 67 have reported, and those segregated ballots from the 67 counties that have reported amount to less than 8,000 votes. There's 7,800 ballots in question
All right.
that are being segregated
That
because
too won't work. So,
everybody told them to segregate them.
Yeah. So
Now
they
the
follow
fact
the
that they're
rules.
segregating them is an equal protection problem.
Right.
But there's only 7,800 of them.
Yeah. That'd be an interesting outcome.
And Biden won by, 42,000, 46,000, something like
Yes.
that.
Now the courts can say, alternatively, you know what? We find your case has merit. We're only counting the 7,800 ballots. That's it. That's the whole election.
Well, and they all have to go to Trump. It's
Oh, do they? I didn't realize that they had
well,
asked
they
that.
would. I mean,
Would they? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Are they the 78? Have they looked at these ballots? They know what they're.
well, they would have to all go to him,
Yeah.
right?
You would think that they would ask
I
for
mean,
that
if
in
you
the
only
suit.
count 7,800 and 7,000 of them go to Biden, then
Yeah. Well, then they're wrong too. They use
so you
their
just
pen
have to
illegally.
toss the whole of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, basically. So, well, that was one of the scenarios that got war gamed out at some point. I think they got there by a different route, but somebody's simulation, not the Jeffrey Toobin naked simulation, but a different one, done beforehand that posited that I guess the two slates showing up from Pennsylvania was the original idea, but they might end up just wiping out Pennsylvania because no slates show up
Right.
instead.
Or what they're really going to try to do is to have the Pennsylvania legislature decide that they're going to put in their own electors.
Yes.
I mean, that's the end game. But again, that's not enough for Trump to win on its own.
Right. So that will lessen their likelihood of doing it, or they're not going to. You would think they wouldn't stick their necks out if it also wouldn't work.
Take away Biden's 20 Pennsylvania electoral votes, and he still has 270.
Yeah. So
and we still have Georgia to come. So
right. So that likely doesn't do it unless they just plan to then say, all right, we'll find some other state to reverse. I don't know how they do it, but if they're just winning by magic, then I guess you continue to do that. But the original simulation in which Pennsylvania was pivotal was a very closely divided electoral vote count, and we don't have that. So that's a big difference. I'm not reassured necessarily by the pronouncements from out of the Pennsylvania state legislature. They keep saying 90% of what you need to hear in order to foreclose that possibility, but they keep holding that 10%. There was Rick Santorum on election night saying, reading the past note from the state House Speaker saying, look, it's off the table. We're not going to do that. There's no role for us in designating a different set of electors. And apparently they wrote a op-ed prior to the election saying the same. And now their new statement is very oddly formulated that we would very much like to adhere to the tradition of giving the electoral vote slate to the person who won the popular vote in Pennsylvania. That would be great. Love to do that. Okay, well, are you gonna? Like to. Okay, but that's not it. You will. That's not a commitment. And even if it's a yes, you're a Republican. That might be a no. I don't know. So they're not clearing anything up. But yeah, this relates back to the punditry telling us, stop panicking, people. Everyone should be complacent heading into Georgia. I think not, but not just for Georgia's sake.
Not just for Georgia's sake. This is really, it's still very scary. Still very scary.
Yeah.
I don't like it to be.
No.
It would be really fun to just be celebrating today, and I am. I mean, I slept all night.
Oh, good.
The whole night through. That doesn't happen anymore.
Right. And that was the original design, you know.
So, yeah, there is tremendous relief. There is knowing that nothing Trump can do will keep Joe Biden from being president on the 20th of January.
Right. We think.
We think. But what they're going to put the nation through in the next 2.5 months is very, very scary.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, we're bracing for that. And let's see. And also, of course, for let's say we settle all of that on December, whatever it was, 14th, I guess. Is right
14th,
the end of, right?
yeah.
But
and then
before then,
we go back to me being very scared for the past 2 months about the fact that they made December 11th the day when the government runs out of money.
Yeah.
What were they thinking?
Right, I don't know. That's interesting, and of course they placed it in outside of. It's not the same issue, but it is interesting that they placed it outside of our safe harbor date. So that's kind of interesting too. So we'll see in quick succession, somewhere around the 11th. If things go well, the lame duck congressional passage of a continuing resolution that will take us into the beginning of the Biden administration and a brand new Congress. And if things, and then 2 days later, the vote of the Electoral College. And then, if everything's okay, we sit and wait and see whether there's anything Trump can screw up in between then and Inauguration Day.
Yeah.
But we might enter a quiet period. I assume, on the other hand, you're really talking a lame duck Congress with literally nothing to lose for a lot of them, and a lot of people who were turned out by the voters and who are Republicans as well. And do they want to give the finger to the country? Do they want to burn it down?
Well, and you have to think about those that are up in 2022.
Senate, right?
All the Republicans and those who think that they can run for president in 2024.
Yes, right, also.
And that Venn diagram overlaps a little bit with, like, Marco Rubio.
And,
how scorched earth are they going to be thinking that they have to fight against having a primary challenger from the right and or stake their claim as the next coming of Trump for 2024.
Yeah. See which direction they go. And,
they're going to go extreme.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That's a big block of him. And, McConnell, that's always his excuse to do the worst that he can, to say, well, I've got to have the majority of my majority. So,
Right.
These guys say I can't do it, I can't do it.
Right.
And that's the other thing that's happening right now is we still don't have stimulus.
Right,
For
true
the
also.
pandemic. I mean, still supposedly McConnell and Pelosi are going to bring up negotiations again.
Oh, all right.
McConnell, the day after the election, was sort of like, well, yeah, people are still hurting. I got to do something. And then we got jobless claims again that he's saying, oh, well, look how wonderful everything is. We don't need to do much.
Okay. He sounds like somebody who's just stood for election and been in touch with the people.
Right.
So wasn't paying much attention.
With these 2 Georgia elections coming up,
yeah,
he's not going to be amenable to doing anything important, anything good.
Yeah, that too seems, I guess, just from my Democratic mind, not a particularly good strategy, standing in the way of stimulus and then saying, let's have an election for control of the Senate. But I don't know, sometimes...
So we're not Republicans.
Yeah, right. That's my problem. I don't understand them very well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think I know what they're going to do. I just don't know why it is. they decide to do it. So, yeah, that'll be interesting. And, of course, if we win the 2 and it's 50-50, I'm sure you were thrilled to find out that Joe Manchin wants to be a Republican or something like that.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. I mean, we knew he's said for a long time that he opposed all of this stuff and the idea of filibuster reform and expanding the courts, etc. We'll see. Circumstances can change. If they're literally getting 0 done, even Joe Manchin gets fed up once in a while. But
once in a while, if they can find something that's specific to Joe Manchin that he needs,
right?
Maybe they can get him to change his mind.
Yeah. So we'll be searching high and low for things like that. I got some ideas, but you never know with this guy. And all right, well, why don't we visit again next Tuesday?
I'm sure we will.
I think we should. So much can change in between then and now, but this has been a pretty good week in between our last 2 Tuesdays.
It has. It's been better than it's been bad.
Yes, right.
That makes sense.
Yep, you got some sleep in, we got some celebration in.
That's almost as bad as Build Back Better.
Yeah, that was not a huge success. But, hey, they won the election.
It worked. It won.
We got past the finish line. Okay, thanks, June. We'll check in with you next week. Check it out. See you again next week.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, thanks very much for doing so. And now, of course, it's time to listen to Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I can't even imagine what he's got on tap for you today, but we've been ignoring the international angle for a while. And look, the news is in from Ukraine. The Ukrainian president, by the way, tested positive for COVID-19. Poor Ukraine. Gee whiz.